Welcome to the Human Side of Emergency Management podcast. And today I have the pleasure, Scott is with me today. Scott was an emergency management specialist working on international wildfire and as an emergency management coordinator for USAID. Your fire career started in 1999 and you rose to the ranks of captain, but you also have an amazing operational leadership in wildfire response across the globe, across the world. You served as a specialist in several different areas, including in countries like Indonesia, Greece, Turkey, Middle East, Ukraine, among others. We'll learn more as we go through the conversation. I also found it really fascinating that you also were included in several international forums, and the one in the Arctic really fascinated me with the work that they were doing there. Also, the journey that you've been on around the world, it's a side of emergency management that we generally don't talk about or don't think about, because we're generally connected to our community and to the people in our local environments. But your headspace is like huge when it comes to the work that you were doing. And I first met you last year at the conference in Calgary in Canada last October. I think from memory, we were standing there waiting to speak to Stephen Pine.
Yes.
And while we were waiting, we struck up a conversation. I asked you what you were doing, and I just remember standing there in awe, listening to your stories and your experiences and the things that you'd done around the world and what you'd been involved in. And I walked away feeling really quite elevated, because there was a side of emergency management I'd never really given any thought to, because it's never been in my radar. So thank you for those conversations last year, because I really value that. And I know we've stayed in touch since then. So I think it's great that you've agreed to be here and be a part of this podcast, because it's a side that we really don't know enough about. And even though I know USAID is not functioning at the moment, the work that you did was so critical from a worldwide perspective, not from a local perspective. But the work that you did would have drilled down, I'm assuming, to a local perspective. But the first thing I sort of want to talk about with you is you mentioned in a short video that you had that how fires are intensifying. You're saying that the number of fires is not actually increasing, but the effects of the fires when they do start are more intense, and they're burning with more ferocity. I would just like to ask you to talk a little bit about that, because the effects that it would have on those communities around the world, because some of those communities would not really have a history of wildfire.
Well, thank you, Vivian. First, I want to wish you a happy International Women's Day. I forgot to mention that earlier in our previous conversation. I am where I am now in my job, and then as you, I'm honored you would have me on your podcast. But as you illustrated, my career and my kind of worldly outlook is actually due to my mother, who was a archaeologist and a pilot, and just really wanted me to get out and really with that curiosity in me to towards the world and that humanity. In regards to that, the number of fires versus the severity, that was based on a Swansea University study that possibly needs to be relooked at. I mean, because I think at this point we are getting towards maybe where the number of fires is also increasing. But to your point, we are seeing the severity of fires again, just like there's several different there's lots of different, I guess, news articles now on just, the effects of climate change. Climate change isn't just global warming, the old phrase of Earth is getting warmer. It's really also weather is getting more volatile. And
Yes.
fire behavior is based on fuels, weather, topography, and the weather portion of that is getting to, you have foehn winds, much like, Victoria, Western Australia, is experiencing at this point. In your summer, that's one of the things, we're dealing with. And, you're starting to have fires now in, the rainforest in Brazil. I mean, you've always had some fires that are started by squatters or illegal logging or farmers doing agricultural burns. They always were within some type of reasonable control. And now we're seeing just complete, devastation from these fires, where they're what we call a stand replacement fire, and they're just burning in canopies, are certainly not, they're not adapted to fire. We're seeing the same thing in the Arctic, as climate change and the Earth do heat. We are finding that, a lot of that is actually creating higher counts of lightning strikes in the northern latitudes. And so just, numbers wise, you're getting more opportunity for fire. You don't have the people problem, and the rest of the world kind of outside the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's really an anthropogenic problem. I mean, both, of course, because of climate change, but also because majority of the fires in the world are started by people. And that, of
Yeah.
course, in terms of things we've built too, like the railroads and electrical lines that fall to the ground in high winds. So all of that, we are seeing, and it's having a really devastating effect, especially on communities that have never ever experienced anything like this.
Yeah, yeah. And it's I know I've spoken to a few people around the world, and like for instance I was at Scotland, I think it was about 14, 15 months ago. So my family I have in Scotland, and so I try and get over to visit them every couple of years, and they had a wildfire conference at Aberdeen, and I remember going there and I think, right, I'll be in Scotland, I'm going to go to this wildfire conference. To me, wildfires and Scotland just didn't mix. They were never in the same sentence. So when I went along and to this conference, I realized they are literally 20 years behind, if not more, than what we are in Australia, because where we understand wildfire, we research it, we put resources in it because we can see the impacts, communities and people. But they were still in that early stages in Scotland, and I can imagine it's like that around the world. I mean, they don't even really have a volunteer organisation. They don't, like, I think from memory, if they had to bring in a helicopter, it has to come out of someone's insurance. There's not resources out there because they've never had to deal with it. So they don't have the infrastructure to support these small communities. And some of the fires are actually getting quite big now. And they're now talking about having to undertake prescribed burning. But some of the communities just don't even understand prescribed burning. So it's a huge, huge issue that we have to overcome.
We do, and Scotland, I believe, is actually either in the past week or so is I think released kind of their first fire management plan. I believe that I've seen several news clips of clips that come across our desk about the issues there, especially in the moors and the idea of that voluntary model for firefighting. Of course, the challenge with that is, of course, there's only so much funding to train in the normal
Mm.
structure fire and the medical work that these people may end up finding themselves into. But to go through a whole separate wildland fire training now, forest fire training, that's a completely different piece. And of course, there's also a little bit of you you're usually trained to fight fire in your local area. I mean, meaning, of course, there's scientific understanding of how things burn, and because the Scottish landscape hasn't always burned, at least certainly not as it is now, there's not a lot of understanding on how do we train firefighters to, what are our best techniques to use in Scotland. Well, there's never needed to be such a thing, and now there does, and so there's already a little bit behind the curve catching with that. But of course, the great thing about Scotland is it's in the European area, and the whole idea of that is it's still in a very well developed, very well resourced area. And you do have EU resources that if the UK needs to pull them over, but the challenge I think is there. But then in countries that have no capacity to respond, and I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Yeah, no, and I was going to ask you about that. When you've gone into communities around the world that have that, none of that wildfire history, they don't understand sometimes the ferocity of wildfires, how to even fight them or how to stop them. I mean, there would be a bit of a lack of knowledge in some communities around the globe, and especially when there's no infrastructure, I guess we in the Western world take a lot for granted because we have that infrastructure. And if we don't have that knowledge, Australia can get people from America or Canada and bring them over here. And we work very cooperatively. But smaller communities and countries have never experienced this. Like, I think, you've worked in Indonesia. I know they do have peat fires and things, but in terms of wildfires, like burning over large landscapes, it's a totally different mindset. And I'm not sure how you go into a community and help them when this occurs.
In those cases, I think we learned this. I learned this the hard way. I helped support. You mentioned my previous career with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I was in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, which is the disaster response arm, at the time, the International Disaster Response Arm of the U.S. government. And we had a wildfire unit. So we would support wildfire response units. So we would support host nations that requested assistance, usually with technical assistance. This was never traditionally operational, so we're not sending airplanes and firefighters. We did send personal protective equipment, other hand tools, things they could use for on the fire ground. But one of the pieces I found is really in places like Indonesia, and it was a steep learning curve for me. Unfortunately, it was after the event was over in 15. There, you don't have fires typically running across the landscape. You have, as you mentioned, peat fires. Well, unbeknownst, to me at the time, and this is really what kind of started changing my trajectory in wildland fire to start looking at the human side of fire. As your podcast illustrates, in that we were focused on providing equipment and providing technical assistance to the Indonesian Emergency Management Agency (BNPB), to their Forest Service, which is KLHK, their Indonesian Bahasa acronyms. And so we started working on that. At the same time, there was hundreds of thousands of people that we weren't seeing that were getting sick from smoke exposure because of peat.
Yeah, yeah,
And where you have wildfires run across the landscape in Victoria or in California, in Greece, in these kind of Mediterranean, very dry climates, you do have your problem. Your threat there, of course, is the actual flames, and of course, just because they come so fast, they burn people as they're trying to evacuate. Indonesia, it's a smoke piece, and while the fires aren't typically running over entire villages, again, this was based on a study that Harvard and Columbia did while our team was there and while we're managing this. They did the study later, but during the time period we were there, that there was over 100,000 deaths from smoke during that
wow,
response, and we
yeah,
completely missed
right,
that. And it's like
yep,
we spent all this time and effort to provide equipment to help fight the fires, and those did need to be put out. But again, peat fires, that's the idea of you need a climatic change. You need the water table to rise because peat is meters and meters deep. I mean, in some
mm,
cases, 10 and 20 meters deep. And so when you have fire burning that deep, if you don't fill up the peat bogs with water, you're never going to reach
yeah,
that, even
yeah,
with the best firefighting equipment. And so the challenge there was we were focusing on the wrong problem, and we were focusing on the operational side. The idea of the old school firefighting where we're providing, rah rah, let's go chase the flames. Well, at the same time, everyone behind us in these homes that have open air houses, they don't have air conditioning, they don't have a new way to get out of the smoke. Their children are getting sick, their elderly are getting sick. And at some point between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, there's over 100,000 deaths. And again, this is in a 3-month period, 15. And so where we thought we had done and had a successful response, later in my mind, like, this was a failure. Our equipment's not going to actually help truly suppress the fires immediately, nor will our PPE, and our technical assistance can help organize, but it's not the rainfall we need. And in that case, you had a El Nino year, you had a positive Indian dipole in the Indian Ocean, and both of those together really makes Northern Australia very, very dry, makes Indonesia very dry.
yes,
And because of that, that's again, we were focusing on the wrong problem. And that's really where for us it was, we need to start looking at, number one, what is, with regard to a fire at least, what is affecting humans the most? Is it the flames like we would see in Victoria and California,
yep.
or is it smoke, or is it post wildfire landslides? From slopes that have had all the vegetation burn off. We save the village from the fire, but then it's buried by a mudslide. So it's cascading effects.
Yeah, it's and that's the beauty of this conversation is that I would never have thought about the smoke impacts on a community in Indonesia because yeah, you're right. Here we fight most of it's the flame effects, the embers, that lodge onto structures and burn them down. That's where our focus is. And we don't always think about those things that surround those wildfires and the things that affect the people. And yeah, no, loving this conversation. It's because there's just so much to learn, and that's what I love about it. Um, pardon me. I mean, part of that is the learning, isn't it? And from that learning, we get better, and we know how to then do things differently, and to make it better. But the work that you do around the world, there was a comment that I read last night which really resonated to me. I mean, you talk about this massive fire that they had in Indonesia, and there's other major events, when Greece had big fires and Portugal had big fires. Media are news outlets. They don't report on this stuff because I guess that they don't really have a vested interest in other countries. But from a firefighter's perspective, this sort of stuff, for me, is critical. And to have that understanding, because I know through what they call the Black Summer fires here in 2019 and 2020, the smoke plume that was coming off that was quite phenomenal. And trying to get your head around that sort of stuff, because my cousin rang me uh, from Edinburgh, and he said, Vivian, how big is this fire that you're fighting? And I sort of went, oh, geez, how do I describe it to someone that lives in Edinburgh? And so I said, put it this way, Stephen, if I got in a car and I drove non-stop from Queensland down to Victoria, where the fires were, pretty much the whole eastern coast of Australia, I said it'd probably take me about 28 hours driving non-stop. That's how long the fire is. It's the only way I could try and describe it. And I had another friend ring up and say, Vivian, how big is this area you're evacuating? So I think they were evacuating a lot of areas around Gippsland because the fires slowly travelled down the east coast. I thought, God, how do I just describe to a structural firefighter in London, the area that we're evacuating? So I actually did a comparison. I said, yeah, it's about the size of Wales. And it's that concept of trying to explain to people. I don't know how you do that, because I struggle.
It's a challenge, for those fires in 2019. I think we had roughly 360 something, U.S. firefighters down helping. But one of the examples is, of course, the smoke plume reached all the way across the Pacific Ocean, which is, of course, enormous. But also, there's been several studies to show that plume actually gave North America an extra year of La Nina.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I'll send you the study after this. The
Yeah.
climatic effects were so significant. It actually affected, again, of course, all that is kind of off the coast of South America, is, the El Nino, the ENSO, and the La Nina, that pattern on the ocean cooling or warming. But it actually, again, because of the effect of shadowing the sun, it actually gave, an extra season. So there's tangible examples. Again, this was something that, it's kind of like fires in the Arctic, as my friend Dr. Edward Alexander mentions from the Gwich'in Council, is the idea of, you have this Yedema, which is, again, a very carbon-rich layer. I mean, it's actually all throughout Ireland and Scotland. Also, that it's basically peat, but it's almost, you could say, super peat, where it has, it's sequestered more carbon than virtually every other carbon sink in the world. And the problem is, a lot of that is in the Arctic Circle. And when that burns, of course, you have the immediate effects of smoke on First Nation and indigenous villages, which, much like, again, our Indonesian communities, you don't have a need for air conditioning in that part of the world. And so you have an open air house. So, and these houses are only so sealed up. And so, you can try to seal off your house, but then sometimes they've shown the air pollution inside can be worse than outside, if you don't have a filter itself. But then there's the climatic pieces of that, where you then, it's complicated to explain this to certainly a politician that wants to hear, what probably in the U.S. at least is called an elevator speech. 6 seconds, 8 seconds. They want a sound bite of why they should care about fires, say in the Arctic or in Indonesia or anywhere where there's not a lot of human population. But we have science through a really complex system that we can show. We know that when there's fires in the Arctic, or there's fires again in Australia, it affects weather patterns, which can affect, given an extra, a continent, an extra, heavy winter season, which typically is what La Nina means here in the United States. It's colder, wetter, but it also can actually affect, the strength of a typhoon hitting Southeast Asia, or, hitting, East Asia and the Philippines. And we know these things, but it's trying to tie those concepts in together in a digestible format. That is one of our greatest challenges that we still have not done well, to where you keep the attention span of leadership, political leadership, who can make decisions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We struggle that with here in Australia, and I know a couple of people I've interviewed share the same thoughts and the same concerns about how do we move forward in the future? How do we make them realize the effects that climate is having? People experience it for themselves, but as you're pointing out very, very precisely about how it's actually, the effects are worldwide. And I struggle sometimes in how I rationalize that. And I have amazing conversations with people, but we all sort of, we know it, we understand it. Sort of a lot of us know what some of the how to solve. I mean, it's all long term, but it's getting over, jumping over that fence and starting. It's really difficult in trying to make sure that we can keep moving forward. And I guess that's part of the learning, that we've got to keep pushing and a lot of keep pushing. Because I mean, even just in this short conversation that we've had, I've already learnt so much from you that I was not aware of or that I didn't understand, because I'm in my background and my comfort zone in firefighting. And there's, as I keep saying, there's a whole world out there. And yeah, you're right. We do need to spend more time trying to get this out. And I'm hoping part of these conversations that we're having on this podcast will help do that. Pardon me. I wanted to talk about briefly as well, in 2022, you talked about the war in Ukraine and the heat waves that were going through Western Europe. Now, I'm not going to get into politics of war or anything like that, but again, it raised an issue for me. As you talk about the war in Ukraine, but I hadn't actually thought about the consequences where it affects emergency management as well. I guess putting the war component off to the side, it's the effects that are left behind. And one of the things that I hadn't realized is that Russia actually supply quite a few aircrafts, and they were available to be, I'm assuming they were hired out to assist with wildland firefighting across Europe. That would no longer be the case. So then they're going to have to source these resources from somewhere else. And I also know there's just phenomenal arboreal forests right through that part of Europe, and they're incredibly at risk. And if they're not having those connections with other countries around them, how do they then fight their wildfires? I mean, the wildfires aren't going to stop. The emergencies aren't, the disasters are still not going to stop. So how do we then reconcile having to work on this? I just couldn't get my head around that one.
War, of course, for all the horrors that war, places on the civilians and the people, the non-combatants, I guess, to use the professional nomenclature, the people that aren't picking up arms. To really illustrate the horrors that they go through, of course, you have the fighting, but then there also is these greater effects. I mean, not even leaving, the territory of Ukraine and kind of Western Russia, you have this issue of the fighting itself is starting fires, but then, of course, no one really wants to go in and fight those fires because, there's active combat going on. So when you're talking about forest fires, there's still a active, there's still a climatic season that goes through, especially in the spring before things really green up there. And then later in the fall, or really kind of late summer, fall, so August, September timeframe, when you still have farmers and ranchers and villagers in those areas, and they have a fire come through, no one is usually going to come in and be able to help them again, because any for the most part, there's I know Ukraine has firefighters that will try to deploy, and Russia will have turn up firefighters to deploy. We saw these fires that, again, if they're in an area where there's landmines buried, no one has the ability to go in there and fight fires safely. And so you
Yeah.
have that piece. But then, yes, expanding out, many of the fires that, many of the countries and really kind of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe relied on Russian air tankers, Russian helicopters, and many still do for firefighting operations. I mean, we supported Turkey in 2021 with wildfires. In many of the aircraft, you know, in Antalya were Breed or Antonov aircraft flown by Russian pilots. That, of course, was before the war. The next year, we were and Greece had the same. And the next year, we were in Greece again for wildfire support. And those aircraft were gone. They weren't there, of course. And then you also have, Mi-8 helicopters, very large Russian-built helicopters. Well, even if the country in question owns that helicopter, the parts are still made in Russia. If there's a war
Yeah,
going
okay.
on and there's embargo, you can't get parts to fix them. And
Mm.
sometimes they're also flown by Russian pilots. And so you have just this challenge of you have an entire, not industry, but you have an entire country whose resources have been pretty vital to, countries as far east as Georgia and Azerbaijan. Suddenly, those aren't available anymore. And, who do those countries turn to? And which is a challenge because
Yeah.
aircraft, especially in firefighting, aircraft right now are, at a premium because so many countries, as you illustrate, are having wildfire issues now, people are outbidding each other for firefighting aircraft. And even though they try to rotate between southern hemisphere and northern hemisphere, one of the things that there's been several studies that have come out recently about, what happens when we have synchronous fire weather, where you have, northern North America, Europe, parts of Asia, all sharing the same fire season. You have a problem because there's not nearly the amount of aircraft to go around, and most
Yeah,
smaller
and
countries can't afford those.
yeah, because we experience that in Australia. Our seasons are getting longer, and so when we say hire resources from Canada or America, you guys still need them because you're burning out of season as well, and so the resources around the world are getting squeezed pretty heavily.
And the industry I know is, we're tied in well. We have been tied in well with the industry just to kind of, we're much of the all of the firefighting resources, aviation wise, in the United States are privately owned for the most part. And so there's United Aerial Firefighters Association. There's several groups that, we worked with in the past to help, internationally help countries find contractors or somebody that can help them when they have aircraft needs. Cause, we don't have, as the US government, we don't have aircraft to send. But and most countries don't. But the idea is also what happens when, if something happens across an ocean, you can't fly a helicopter across the ocean. Usually has to be put on a boat. So even if the
Yes.
country can afford it, it's still going to be a time lag till they actually get that resource. And an airplane, it's the same thing. You have to get overflight permits. It's not like it's a fire truck you can borrow from a neighboring town. They still have to, get all the other legalities to be able to respond. And it's a huge challenge. And I know, different trade groups are looking at that. Different countries are looking at that as sharing resources. You have the rescue system and the United Nations. Of course, you have the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, which is the normal mechanism before they kind of lean on the additional resources. But that still comes at a significant cost, and most areas still can't afford that.
Yeah, it's sort of it puts all these additional layers on trying to manage emergencies and drilling down into the communities. Some communities around the world would be used to having these resources, and all of a sudden they're ripped out, and they're going to be sitting back. Well, what do we do now? How do we manage this? What are our options? And the options are getting smaller and smaller and harder and harder. And it's yeah, no, it's I don't know.
Well, when you look at that too, if a country is not prepared, or really, I shouldn't say they're prepared. All countries usually do their best. Hopefully, if a country is within, is doing right by their people, they're doing their best to prepare within the capacity and the resources that they have. But even then, many times, of course, when you have a fire start, there is this huge impetus to do something about the fire.
Yeah.
I would argue right there is also where typically then you're starting to overlook the human piece because you're trying so hard to get big resources in. Aircraft are valuable, as are firefighters. Aircraft support firefighters on the ground. But again, you still have that human piece. So is just as much attention and frankly funding going into, what if you have a large number of displaced? Where are they going to stay? If their homes are burnt to the ground or the entire village is burnt over, what's going to happen to them? We've struggled with this here in the United States. After several of our devastating fires in California and then Hawaii, we've struggled with how to house people, long-term housing. And so that's an issue. But again, if you're talking, a country in the developing world, in middle income, parts of the world, even high income, again, like the US, everyone struggles with this, but it's
Mhm.
it's it's how much of your focus is involved in that. If you're also trying to focus on just fighting the fire, think of it's kind of like if you're not trained to do that, that's where all your energy goes, not realizing that, wait, I have this whole population over here that the Red Cross, Red Crescent's trying to support, but they usually can't do it by themselves. They need government resources too, but we're overlooking that.
Yeah, no, it's so right. And it's so important that we recognize everything that you're talking about because I know a lot of people go into emergency management because they have a desire to do good. And they have a desire to want to help people, which is fantastic. But then broadening that even further, what can we do to help others around the world that don't have the opportunities that we have or don't have the knowledge or experience? I don't know, maybe we should have an international volunteer system so we can actually, impart our wisdom, impart our knowledge, but it's not just about us giving, it's about us learning and about us listening because I have no doubt there is a lot that we can learn from other communities around the world as well and share in that. You know, I quite often say we've got one mouth, but we've got two ears. And it's really important that we listen and we learn from everyone else because there's just so much knowledge out there and so much that we can share.
And and I think we're looking at it from that perspective on, what can we learn? And first of all, listen. When you go to a country and they're asking for assistance, the first thing, of course, is we've learned this the hard. I've learned this the hard way. When I first started working in this field, there was still this idea of, oh, I'm a firefighter. We're highly trained and we're professional. We know how to handle this. Well, I know how to handle this in my immediate local area and based on my immediate local culture. Like even going from the Western U.S. to the Eastern U.S., or from the north to the south, like it's wildly different worlds and cultures. And, you can find yourself getting sideways with the population fairly quickly. Well,
Yeah.
internationally, of course, it's the same thing. We come in Indonesia, my Indonesia example is the epitome of that, where we went in thinking, I know how to fight fire. Like, let's give them equipment. Let's provide technical assistance and help them with their coordinating all their resources because you have 10,000 islands. But again, that really wasn't the issue. We should have been, plus I was also coming from a humanitarian organization. The whole idea, it's in our name, is, we're supposed to be focusing on the humanitarian aspects of this and getting people to focus on, we'll support firefighting, but let's also work with PMI, which is the Indonesian Red Cross. Let's work with them on setting up clean air shelters and, turning mosques
Yeah.
into clean air shelters to get, vulnerable communities out of the smoke. And so like we can walk and snap our fingers at the same time. Like this isn't that hard. But we also didn't listen because again, those NGOs were in country. They were kind of shouting for resources. And we found that that's the same even sometimes at the government level. We're come in and, now I think we were better. Of course, the winds have changed in the United States for the time being. But, we would show up and really started to listen instead of just showing up and doing what we thought was best. For me, that was the 2014 Ebola response. You
Yeah.
mentioned some of
Okay.
these
Yeah.
other things that we get involved in. While I'm
Yes.
a firefighter for USAID, we also were responders for any humanitarian disaster USAID would get involved in. And so while I had this job, our other job was a responder for Ebola or for other humanitarian emergencies that but we use those same skills in both fields.
Yeah, and you're so right. That cultural aspect is something that we probably need to spend more time on and understanding and looking at the impacts because I know when we're dealing with disasters and emergency management, trust and integrity and compassion are the three things that people always talk about. And if we don't have that when we're going into other areas that we're not familiar with, you're really starting from a really low bar.
Well, 100%. And that's one of the ways we would just gather information is really just to look at news sources from that from that country in that native language. If we didn't have someone that understood the language on our team, then of course, Google Translate's a wonderful thing. We would basically search it, and that's actually how we would also track resources that really had a greater humanitarian effect. Because unfortunately, there's 195 countries in the world, like including the Vatican. So you say, you know, roughly 80% of those, 85% of those have wildfire concerns, significant wildfire concerns. Unfortunately, at this point, you start looking at that. One of the ways we would glean that out is we would use news aggregators.
Yeah,
Set,
okay.
so we would set, wildfire or bushfire, forest fires. The Indonesian term is karhutla, incendio forestal. For Spanish, we would set these in multiple languages, well, dozens of languages. And so every day there's 3 or 4 thousand news sources that pop up with wildfire conversations, and then it's further refined. Now again, AI is of course a
Yeah,
good
yeah,
a
yeah.
good and bad thing, but kind of on the initial stages of AI, even 4 and 5 years ago, we were using it then to query that down to what media is really focusing on, like the displacement of people and how the country, how the government, how the culture was responding to those. Those are also what allowed us to sync up, a heat map using infrared satellites that we could get
Right.
from NASA, Copernicus, or any of the companies out there that are working on wildfire sensing with the human effects on the ground. And those are what we allowed us to kind of sneak up and say, hey, we need to watch this area. This area is getting really stretched on resources. It's in the media. People are starting to get upset at the government, etc.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of what we do, isn't it? That preparedness. And so when something does occur or escalates, we're there ready to rock and roll and be a part of it if we're asked to. I'm just loving this conversation, Scott. It's 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 just a whole side that we really don't think about enough. And it's, even just like as you were just talking about how you monitor what happens around the world. I mean, because countries don't always put their hands up. Sometimes countries don't even know that they need help until a hand of friendship has gone out, and then, they can take that up. So it's just a huge area, and I think we're gonna have more discussions about this.
Absolutely. And of course, I will say one thing that we really, I think we got better at, we weren't good initially, was we would also ask kind of, you could say offline, where we would say, hey, do you need assistance? And many times our teams, of course, can be 2 people, they can be 5 people. They're usually never bigger than that. I mean, we're not there to overwhelm. We're there to, if somebody needs us to fetch coffee while we're there, that's our job. We're there to
Yep,
help. And so
yep,
it doesn't really matter what the task is. It's just to take a little bit of the burden off, but we would always ask, and if there was no press notoriety, that was fine. Again, we're there to come in, get out, because we're not there to build up anything else. At the time, people knew who USAID was. We didn't need to promote that name within that country. We were there to help them leave. And so some countries did want that. They didn't want to publicize that they
yeah.
struggled with wildfires. But I'll say first and foremost, the U.S. pulls in assistance almost every year now to help us with our fires. So it's not like any country at this point can do it really on their own.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a worldwide issue now. It's not isolated to any one country, and I love the way that you do that because, as I mentioned before, that trust and that integrity, especially when you're going into different cultures, is so critical. That listening aspect, so you can understand, but more importantly, give those other cultures and countries the opportunity to take control, learn, know what they want to achieve. I mean, these people in these communities know what they want. They know what their priorities are, and it's up to us to listen in a way that's respectful, and but at the same time help them if they need it or if they ask for it.
And I think empathy comes into that a lot. It's also, doing, your best to, empathize and try to put yourself in that place. And I make that distinction because many times, of course, an emergency response of any type, especially when we're talking about firefighting and medical, there's this idea that you should compartmentalize and you should look at that as just a job, because you do get emotionally tied into it. It can be emotionally draining. And then there's an aspect, of course, also that if you can't help you can't help somebody else if you can't help yourself. And especially if you get really, through PTSD, through these other things, it can really start mentally affecting you, especially when you start seeing even in wildfire, of course, you can see some pretty horrific things. And so
Mhm.
that's one of the challenges. But I still think if we go too far in that realm, then we lose the humanity. We lose the idea of like why we're doing it. And
Yes.
and it's, of course, when you're doing it at an international level, we're always there at the host nation's request. We're there to help. And again, however small, however large that may be, but we're still doing it at a macro level. So it's hard to actually see the tangible effects of what you're doing. But I've gotten to the point in my career where I look at it as if I've helped one person, if I've helped one, pregnant woman get out of the smoke and protect her child, and where again that child hopefully will thrive when they're born, then that's a win, even if it's just one, because
Yes.
and that's all you can hope for. Because again, unlike direct operational firefighting, when you're at a local level, you're not going to be saving one home and completely. I helped save this home. You're hoping you're doing something, but especially when you open up a shelter and you have people coming in and utilizing it, or you're
Yep.
providing firefighting equipment and it goes immediately out to the line to help protect firefighters from being injured, that's a win. I mean, that's kind of where I draw that's a win right there.
Yeah, and I can imagine some areas that you go into, they don't want to be told what to do, they don't want to be shown what to do, but it's really valuable having someone standing beside you, someone that's standing beside you that you can just bounce ideas off or share or just to talk to or just to have a conversation.
I don't know anybody that ever wants to be told what to do.
Oh, yeah.
I think about your countrymen and mine, but no, I think this is also where it's having that emotional intelligence to provide advice when asked, and really it's coaching. It's the idea of like,
Yeah.
hey, and I found what's somewhat helpful is also not to always explain again how to do it, because I again talk about local context and talk about listening to the population you're supporting. I don't know how to do it locally, but what I can tell you is what has failed for us. And if it's failed for us, it might fail for you, it might work out for you. And so that's kind of where I start a lot of the conversation is I'll say, hey, we've tried this, but it's failed. And so, because especially if they're looking going down that road too,
Yeah.
and maybe that'll divert them to look. But I'm not telling them what to do. I'm just telling them what not to do in a way. And that's I find that's also more effective because it still gives them the knowledge of kind of a lessons learned real time. But then I'm not trying to direct them one way or the other. Again, if they're asking for it, we'll still help guide. When it comes down to it, it's still their country, their responsibility, but also they know the culture. They know, and
They know
some of
their
these positions,
people.
they know their people.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a valuable conversation, Scott. I've really valued sharing this today because there's just so much that we can learn, and I just love the way that you shape that conversation around the world and the things that you've been involved with. I'm definitely going to have to pick your brains again and have a more deeper conversation about the people, and I think we've really just not even skimmed the surface.
Well, I see it on the shoulders of giants. So I mean, everything again. My mother, my father. The leadership I've been I've had the honor to work for over the years. I mean, they're the ones that have kind of set me up where I'm at least aware of this stuff. I hope I have some positive effect on the world, but it's for at my career now, especially coming in as a career firefighter, but really not transitioning out of it, but really just trying to push much of what you're doing here with this podcast is we're to a point where almost I feel like we're losing sight of the human side of this. That there is a very big equation. I mean, there's a whole recovery piece, that is over with wildfire with any disaster is continually overlooked. And of course, when the news cameras leave, when the interest dies off, it's usually not too much longer. The government interest dies off, and then you still have a population that's in great, psychological and
Pain. It's like
eh,
this collective pain,
trauma.
yeah, and talked about that before, and it's something I definitely wanna delve into after going through some catastrophic fires myself and around my local community as well that were involved, and also being involved as a career firefighter. It's a whole I don't know, I don't even know how to describe I actually call it a collective pain, and I also refer to it as my bucket, my emotional bucket, and when it overflows, and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, no, that's a huge there's so much to talk about, and I think that's gets to the heart of what we do, and that's the heart of why I started this podcast is because emergency management, I know my comfort zone is in fire, but as you mentioned, there's health and disease and mudslides and building collapse. Emergency management is massive, and it's about bringing that awareness. But for me and for you and the people that I speak to, it's bringing that human side into it because that's at the heart of what we do.
It is, and I think the one piece that I also it's kind of heard this or heard a similar vein to this years ago, and it's really kind of stuck with me that part of the reason why I think the human aspects gets overlooked a bit or sometimes a lot in wildland fire and wildfire is because it's one of the only disasters, natural disasters we choose to fight. Typically, we're not, we don't actively fight typhoons. I mean, of course, in the literal sense, like we're doing a wildfire. We're not fighting earthquakes or volcanoes. We respond to the effects of them. And so because we're not really that's not the impetus for fire, we're looking at really that kind of before piece, the response itself, we're forgetting the effects. And that, there's still effects of this disaster. It's still very much a natural hazard that has now become a disaster because humans are in the
Yeah.
way. And so that is in my mind, that is part of the challenge that I'm trying to also tweak is let's not lose sight of this is still a disaster with humans involved. I know we need to fight it versus again, we don't worry about this with any other natural disaster we have. I mean, I think our U.S. Corps of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers says they fight floods, but I would argue you're not really fighting. That'd be like blowing up the clouds, and
More
we're
trying
not
to divert, I think.
we're not doing that. We're still responding to the effects of the rain that's fallen. here we're actually trying to suppress the flames. But again, that comes at the cost of overlooking the human aspect of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of leads me to my closing question that I give to everyone. Um, and when everything else falls away, the roles, the expectations, the pressure, what remains at the core of your leadership in the work that you do? What is the one thing that keeps you going?
For me, my people and the people that and the people that I'm helping. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's still that number one is, I always look out for, especially in a leadership position, always look out for your people. It's like leaders eat last. But the idea of also the people you're trying to help, are, that is the reason you can't lose sight of that. For every other, all the other noise and distractions out there, there's still a human at the end of that
Yeah,
disaster that needs help. That's having a really, a really bad day.
absolutely. And that's why I have the tagline for the podcast, it's at the heart of what we do, because it's that human aspect. Just a final question. Do you think there's anything that I've not covered that you believe that we should discuss? I know we're probably going to run out of time today, but we'll definitely be having another podcast at some stage to expand and drill down a little bit more on the work that you do.
I think, a lot of it is also looking at maybe the cascading effects of fire. I mean, we talked about the smoke piece, but of course you have a post wildfire piece, which is really, and then again, when I start looking at numbers, I really enjoy science and numbers. And smoke is the number one greatest killer wildfire, from fire. And
Yeah.
usually, and then afterward, after that, it's basically post secondary effects. So it's, post wildfire landslides, mudslides. Typically it's not the flames. And so and it's realizing that, you have climate change and we're putting smoke in the air, which just exacerbates climate change. So you have that cycle. And then you have the cascading effects of fire in terms of course, the immediate threats, but then livelihoods. And so you have, you know, uh, subsistence. You have farmers, you have ranchers, you have people that work in forest products that are suddenly all out of work. Any type of agricultural industry that are out of work. Sometimes short term, sometimes for the rest of their lives, and that creates again, if anything, a urban migration, which then just this is what they've seen, especially in Europe, where then much of the landscape goes back to somewhat of a feral landscape, but also unfortunately, because of the way we built and the lack of risk mitigations we have in place, you then, of course, have a wildfire problem too. I mean, even if the things are naturally inclined to burn, like in the Mediterranean area, you still have people living in those areas which need to be managed. But if you have no one living there to manage them, that's a problem. And they found this with wildfires in Turkey and Greece. And Croatia, where people will move out of the rural areas, especially when their livelihoods are lost, and move to a larger city because
Yeah.
that's where the jobs are. And then if in Portugal, Tiago Oliveira, the chair of the Rural Fire Integrated Fire Management, has mentioned that this is one of Portugal's biggest problems is you have land bifurcation, privatized land, but it's not managed because
It's not
there's no
managed.
livelihoods out there anymore.
Yeah, no, that's so true, and thank you for raising that. We'll definitely look at doing a podcast on that. And Scott, I can't thank you enough for being a part of my podcast, The Human Side of Emergency Management. It's been an absolute privilege to share with you today, and thank you for sharing your stories and your journey.
Well, thank you, Vivian, for having me. I'm honored that you're having me on your podcast. I'm flattered that you'd ask, and yes, I'm happy to support. I'm looking forward to hearing the podcast in the future. So thank you again, and again, happy International Women's Day.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And for a chance meeting at a conference last October in Calgary, I think we've striking up some excellent conversations.
Well, you give me a lot to think about. You always, again, learning from others is, even just the idea of you mentioned, writing thoughts down, writing things down, because again, if anything, it helps. It's cathartic, and if anything, just to get out, thoughts, good and bad. It's a
Yes.
wonderful thing.
Yeah. No. Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Vivian.